The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Before we get into today's episode, the 360 Energy team would like to thank you for making this yet another exciting year of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. In our third year of podcasting, we reached over 20 countries, produced 40 plus episodes of new content, featured over 20 expert guests on our show, pulled in thousands of listens, and entertained hundreds of listeners to whom we are so grateful. Welcome back, Dave and John.
It's really good to be back, and welcome back to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Lysandra, you were missed by John and I.
Yeah, it's good to be back, and it was great listening to you two carry the show. All right, so today we're talking about the energy transition, and in simple terms, what is it and why is it needed?
Okay, I think we should make it clear that energy transition is one of the newer expressions being used. It's really what energy transition is about. It's all part of the drive to reduce carbon emissions. And the energy transition really is moving from fossil fuel-based forms of energy to renewable or low carbon forms of energy. So that in very simple terms, what it is. I think the expression has been adopted by a number of people because of the discomfort with terms like net zero and, carbon reduction. It puts it in a slightly softer light, but I think it's also a very realistic term, because if we are going to go from where we are today to not emitting greenhouse gases in the future, we've talked about this before, we won't be stepping off a cliff edge. It won't be a step change. It will be a transition. And energy is a key contributor of greenhouse gases. So we have to have an energy transition.
Well stated, John. I'm going to add a little juice to that. We've had guests who've talked about this energy transition, and John has conveyed in previous podcasts this type of thing has been going on and will continue to go on for years. Like it's been going on 20, 30 years back. But what I think is going to be different is that I think in the next 10 years, it will advance quicker than it's ever done in the past. And I'll just give you an example. I was listening to MSNBC this week, and the CEO of Stellantis was talking about how there's currently 15 to 20 automotive assembly plants. In 10 years, he's suggesting there's only going to be 5. Now, if you think in where we're located in Canada and in specifically Ontario, the automotive assembly operation is a pretty big market share of the manufacturing piece. And effectively, if what he's saying is true, that it will be a game changer, and it will be fast. Like in 10 years, that's fast in many terms. So just to add more to this, just to reinforce this, he was conveying that Stellantis will have a battery that will actually operate a car. It can run for 500 miles this year. And then one of our guests, Markham Hissop, who actually is an energy journalist, was conveying recently that some of the research that he's found is that the cost of a battery will drop in half in 2024. So I'm bringing this up because that speed of execution, which, by the way, I don't think most people understand, appreciate, or probably even accept, is occurring. And that's a massive disruption to the current piece. So I think this is really timely because in my view, and we're going to get into this, I think most customers don't appreciate or accept this is going on. And the ones that don't, I think they'll be problematic.
I think energy transition is also often associated with many other words. Like John previously said, net zero, the carbon neutral transition. There's lots of different terms that are thrown around. What is the place of energy efficiency in the energy transition?
I'll start this off, John. It's the first and one of the fastest and most effective ways for organizations to undertake. And John and I were talking about this yesterday. Energy efficiency has been talked about for years. typically people are very dependent on focusing on equipment technology to make that change. But for some reason, in my view, and I certainly would encourage John to give his, it's not talked about as much. It seems like it's lost its luster, or people think they've done it all. When I can tell you from our experience and working with clients, they actually aren't doing it, and they stop doing it. They think they need to have incentives to do it. So it's one of the most cost-effective ways in this energy transition where you're actually not needing the energy because you've improved your efficiency. I think it needs to be a focus. I know there's people in the industry that are trying to do that, but I'm going to say to you, quite frankly, I don't think society actually appreciates or understands how important it is now to even do even more so. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's the starting point of the transition. I mean, it was once said, and it still stands, the greenest kilowatt hour is the one that you don't use. It should also be the cheapest one because you're not spending that money on it. And if you're going to go into alternative, particularly if part of your transition is to look at on-site generation, it makes sense to reduce the energy that you're using so that you don't have to buy a bigger renewable plant than you need. I'm afraid some people want the simplicity of, oh, we'll do a straight switch. We'll go from dirty energy to clean energy. Isn't that great? Now, one of the things that is happening that is good is the cost of, let's call it clean energy. There used to be a premium on that. That's not so much the case now. And so, fuel swapping, changing from a brown electricity provider to a green one, doesn't necessarily cost you money or over and above what it would. But you've got to understand what you're using. You've got to be able to strike a contract. You've got to know what your demand is. You've got to do all the basics of energy management. And Lysandra, you said the place of energy efficiency. I'm going to broaden it. It's the place of energy management, because energy management is also about procuring energy. And that's a really key part of the energy transition, knowing how to procure cleaner energy, knowing what the issues are in purchasing it, what the kind of contracts are, how clean is it. All of this is at the front end. And it's really a case of get your house in order, make yourself efficient, then move on. I will caveat that slightly. It doesn't mean to say go out and spend masses of capital making yourself more efficient to start with. No, it's doing what's often referred to as the low-hanging fruit, the easy bits. Understanding how you use energy is vital before you can actually transition. So it's doing those soft things, the low-cost things, and doing them first.
Yeah, I think anytime a new topic or trend gets introduced, we often tend to overcomplicate it and run with that for a couple years and then get back to the basics. So I really do like the mention of energy efficiency because it does bring you back to the basics of what are you using today and how can you be the most efficient?
Yeah, more bang for your buck. It's simple. Funny enough, it's what business is about. How do you get maximum value out of something? And yet, when it comes sometimes to energy, there is this blind spot. I've met executives who've regarded their energy spend a bit the same way as they would regard the rental of the buildings they're in, or something like that. Oh, it's a fixed cost. It's there. You just do it. You look at them, they will focus on if they're making things out of metal. They might be really worried and looking at the cost of metal and understanding where that is, when to buy it, when to not buy it. And then they just go, well, energy, well, we just buy it. We don't even think about it. We need to think about it more.
And John, based on our previous comments, clients and users are going to have to do this more now than they've ever considered going forward if they want to remain competitive. This is a business decision. This isn't tree hugging. This is about remaining viable and competitive going forward. Again, I don't think people fully comprehend what this is all about.
Well, on that note, Dave, I noticed your recent LinkedIn post where you mentioned a PwC report highlighting that 45% of businesses believe they won't survive without transformation in the next decade. How do you think this relates to energy and carbon management for clients?
Well, thank you for bringing that up, Lysandra. I think that certainly the survey results are probably talking about a variety of things that actually businesses are looking at and what they need to do going forward. I just think this transition, as we've been saying from the get-go from this podcast, will be a critical piece for end-use clients to embrace, engage, not only to reduce and making sure their costs are competitive, but also the idea of developing products for this transition to enable. And so if companies don't fully comprehend, and they don't, like I'm going to be very candid, most customers don't fully comprehend this transition or deny it's happening or should happen, then they won't be in the forefront. And so if you're not thinking that way, this comment of the CEO saying in 10 years, if they don't transform, they won't have a business. I think it's true. And I'm just using the lens of the energy transition that I think if it's not considered or thought of within organization, and I'm saying all organizations too, by the way, I'm not being selective. I think this is going to impact everyone. Again, this isn't something that I thought of, but people have talked about this being an industrial revolution based on the energy markets and what's going to happen. And so it will be a game changer. And so I'm really hopeful that in going forward that the CEOs start thinking about the energy transition, how that's going to impact their costs and how that's going to impact their product and service offering, because I think it will. And the ones that fail to do that, I think they'll be in big problem.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, it's interesting. If you go back to the early days of the Harvard Business Review, in a lot of their papers there, they talk about you have to innovate, you have to change to have a surviving business. And they made a comment some time back about when there's a recession, sometimes people back off doing things. But they found that the organisations that embraced a recession, got on and did things, came out the other side of it fitter and healthier. And I think there is this whole thing in business that sometimes people will say, oh, the business is failing because of the economic climate, because this has happened and because that has happened. Sometimes it is that, but it's a failure to recognise where the opportunities lie. Now, I think years back we had a thing called business process re-engineering, which was a very popular approach. I actually think we are going to have more and more organisations rethinking how they do business. Retail has changed massively. Retail used to be going what you would say to the mall, we would say to the high street, and you would go and you would buy everything there. That model is changing. You've touched on electric vehicles. Whether you believe in them or not, and whether they're green or not, the electric vehicle revolution is happening. It changes the way we travel. And I think what I hope is that the organisations that are grasping we need to change realise that they need to include energy as part of that change and not just ignore it and think it'll follow along behind. Because in many cases, the changes are being driven by sustainability issues.
Yeah. So, John, you and I are beating the drum, and quite frankly, we've been doing this for years. I think I'm encouraging our listeners, like how or what can be done in your organizations to actually ignite that thinking. Like because I think there's a lot of stalemate in this. And I actually worry, we're going to get into this later, but I do worry about Canadians being laggards in this whole piece. And, we have ample supply of fossil fuel and we do really well by it financially. So there's probably not a rush to move or change in that. But I think that's short-term thinking. I think we'll still be using fossil fuels, but in a reduced way. And we got to start thinking how we capitalize on this transition versus, just being a taker. Because I think the people that lead in this, the first movers, like we heard about Purolator that had talked about stuff. I was interviewing Staples. Like these people have been doing this stuff for a while. I think those people that are way ahead of the game or thinking ahead of the game, they'll have a stable and sustainable business model, right? I think that will be, and I think that's how it has to happen. So how do we ignite this thought process in society?
I think, Dave, I think you're right. I think you've got to ignite it at all sorts of levels. And I think that's part of the problem. Earlier today, I was talking to a sustainability manager from a very large legal practice. And they were saying to me, oh, yes, we are engaged with this. However, we're not really sure the managing partner believes in climate change. So there you go. This organisation's trying to do things, and they're saying, well, that managing partner steps down later this year. Maybe things will change for the better. And then another part of the conversation, and clearly I'm not going to name the law firm given what I'm saying. Another part of the conversation was they were saying, and of course, one of the problems that we've had and firms like us have is, where does sustainability fit within our business model? And this is something that they need to think about. And you only have to start thinking about it a little bit and realising that sustainable companies will want sustainable lawyers. Sustainability itself introduces new legal problems. So your law firm needs to understand those things. Very simple things in this country, you probably have the same thing. If somebody's in a multi-tenanted building and they want to put solar panels on the roof, the leases, the agreements and everything that has to be done, it all has to be there. And I think it was really reassuring that this firm, interestingly enough, had taken their sustainability manager, they had taken them from the automotive industry, one of the UK, small number of UK vehicle builders that are left. So they were doing the right thing there, but you still wonder, has the organisation as a whole grasped the whole issue? And I think this is this whole thing about transforming. What are we saying? You've got to manage energy. You've got to deal with it, but it's got to be part of your business model. You need to do it both together.
And John, you raise another point that I know we've been beating the drum on like forever, and that means it's not one person, not one department.
No.
Whether it's legal, whether it's financial, whether it's operations, whether it's maintenance, whether it's HR, they all will play a role to advance this thinking within the organizations. And again, you and I have been doing this for so long. When we see that they compartmentalize it and say, well, that's your job, we've done it, we've checked the box. Yeah, you click the box, but you're actually not making any headway. Yeah, and not as fast as you can or should be, in summary.
Yeah, I think you're right. You were saying we've been banging the drum. I think we've been banging it so long we need to get a new one, and it needs to be a bit bigger and a bit louder.
That's why we have Lysandra.
Yes.
John.
Yeah, but what you're so right there is the multidiscipline approach to it. And a good example somebody shared with me was that they said, if you look at human resources, how it operates in most organisations now, you have a human resources department, but every line manager is expected to take responsibility for human resources activity.
Yes.
And the HR department are there as the specialist support.
Yes.
What we've ended up with in energy management, we've had an energy management department that's specialist support and the doers, and everybody's going, well, we don't need to do anything. It's all lodged there.
Yes, for sure.
Dave, you mentioned you both have been doing this for years, which you're showing your age a little bit saying that. But
it's only 2 years, Lysandra. That's what we've only been done for 2 years now.
Given both of your extensive experience working with businesses of all sizes in Europe and Canada, what trends are you noticing in the marketplace? How are companies responding to the changing energy landscape?
Okay, so I'll take a cut, John, here in Canada. It's interesting. So there's two segments that I see. They see that they need to respond, and they need to respond quickly. It's interesting. It's automotive parts companies. We've had two that have reached out to us, and it's actually a really interesting story. They're not necessarily, one isn't necessarily a big organization. It would be deemed as an SME. And it's been dictated that they need to enhance their EcoVadis score by May, and they don't know how to do it. And so and what we heard is if they don't do it, that they will lose their customer, which is one of the big three here in North America. So they're panicking. And then another automotive parts company now, it's actually owned traded on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and there's a requirement for them to make changes, and they are committed and suggesting they wanted to get to net zero by procurement by energy by 2025. That's a huge task, and truthfully, not sure if that can be done with all renewables based on the size of them. But that's the speed at which they're going. Now, it's also interesting, John, that the person that brought us in from this SME that has to move very quickly is an HR person. It was her role to actually make this happen with the organization. I had never seen that before. Never seen that before. So you see this movement by certain parties that are moving very quickly, but I'm going to tell you that it's rare. Like that's not a majority of clients. I would say to you, that might be 5% or less from what I view. So, but I think it's the canary in the coal mine. I actually think what's going to happen is it is going to accelerate, and the needs will be, and there won't be resources or knowledge base to actually help people. And then they'll start making bad decisions. Like you say, they'll start spending money really on things that maybe not be the best thing for it. So I think it's going to happen. I'm smelling and seeing it happen in real time. So I think it will, but I do worry, and that's why we've encouraged this podcast, because I think people need to get on this now so they don't get in a bad way. That's from my take, John, here in North America. I'd be interested in you guys are, I would say you're the grown-ups in the room. You guys have been doing this for a long time, so I'm interested in what's happening on your end.
Okay. Before I do, just in case our listeners not aware of, EcoVadis is a sustainability rating service, and it's one of those that's very often used by large organisations to sort of control the sustainability credentials of their suppliers. I don't know. You say we're the grown-ups in the room. I'm gonna start treading on some dangerous grounds. I think we were the grown-ups in the room. I think the UK was a bit more of a grown-up in the room when it was part of the European Union. I think leaving the European Union, I'm one of the people, this is great, it would be interesting to see if any people are listening to this who've got a strong view on it. I'm one of those people who say I have yet to see a real benefit from us having left the European Union. That's one side of it. I think the other side here is that what has happened in the past couple of years, of course, has been the impact of the conflict, the war, whatever you want to call it, in Ukraine. And we've talked about this before on our podcast. We are now marking 2 years of that conflict. Now, that has made people think about energy. We know from some of our guests that Europeans have done quite a good job at becoming energy efficient without Russian oil and gas. I think in this country, we've been a little bit looking almost for a handout from the state, and in fact there was for a while to help people through. We are now beginning to see energy prices fall. What worries me is my long experience in energy particularly in the UK and Europe, is when energy prices are high, people are running around going, what can I do? And are not quite sure what to do. When the prices fall, they go, oh, it's all right now, we don't need to do anything. And this is why you have to have a consistent approach. What we are seeing more and more discussion of electrification. Problem is that is becoming, and I think it's the same in many jurisdictions, it's becoming a binary topic when in fact it's not a binary topic. What I mean by that is some people think you've got to electrify everything immediately tomorrow, and they can't see how that can work. And guess what? They're right. Because
they're right.
You need the transition. But what we are experiencing in this country is certain, and I'm going to call them right of centre commentators, who the immediate approach is to say that things like net zero, the transition, they're unnecessary. They're an additional burden. They're something we don't need to do. So whilst we are saying that, organisations, end users and people have got to do something, there is a big concern for me that government doesn't necessarily engage with it properly. Now, you may be aware, I think is 42 leading economies over this year will have general elections. I think it's something like 2 billion people in the world will be voting, and there will be changes of government. You in North America, you've just got to think about Donald Trump, who's just won another primary, and the impact that he may have on energy and the other markets. Here, we could possibly, people are predicting, you've got to be careful of predictions. They're predicting that our current Conservative government will lose badly, and we will have a Labour government in place. But interestingly enough, our Labour government has abandoned its commitment to spend something like 28 billion on green economy. And you might go, are they abandoning the principles? It's an interesting one. The reason that they've said that they're not going to do it is they've been looking at the books and they don't think the money's there. So
Yes.
they don't want to commit to it in that sense.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we could be facing a very interesting time as and when we have a general election, and it could be any time between now and the end of the year. We could see a change of government. 3 to 6 months after that, we could see some new and some interesting policies coming in place. But market trends, I think pretty much people have engaged with energy, but they're still engaging more with the technology. Let's get LED lighting, let's do this, let's do that, rather than how do we understand it, how do we manage it better?
So they look at a transaction. That's what they're looking at. It's a transaction, not looking forward. Lysandra, if you'll bear with me, I'd like to turn this around. And that is you, as you said, John and I, have done this for a while. You're newer in the game. You and your colleagues are going to have to carry the ball, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you think needs to be done? How's this transition? And I'm also mindful you are also involved in the utility industry, so you'll have that mindset because you'll be exposed to that. So I'll be interested in your take.
Yeah, I would say, and the more and more I get exposed to different types of companies, I realize we all follow one thing, and that's if something's a legal requirement, then you're bound to do it. Right? Okay. And I know a lot of people have conflicting views on that. I know obviously you would hopefully want to choose to be more energy efficient and choose to be more carbon neutral per se. However, I do think for all companies to ultimately get to that point, I do think it would need to be a legal requirement and have more push from the government. And I even think when you look at, when we talk about the COPs and we talk about any of these global meetings on how we're going to tackle climate change, it's government leaders that are meeting to make these decisions and have these discussions. Well, they come back and there's really not much push from government to organizations to start doing the transition. So I do find that's probably the biggest gap. I do worry that maybe a year or two before it's time for us to hit a target, that governments will start making this more of a legal thing and organizations will be rushing to meet it. I do wish we had a more proactive stance on that. Whereas right now, I feel like it's all very reactive still.
Can I just pick up real quick on that? I have always been big on market solutions. Mm-hmm. I'm not convinced in this piece that actually the market actually is open to market solutions. That means charging for pollution, which I think some parties aren't interested or don't want that or don't agree with that. So it goes against my principles, but I'm going to convey to you that I'm in total agreement. I think it's going to have to be regulated. Yeah. And I think it will be regulated sooner than people think because it's going to have to be regulated. The cost of overcoming the cost of climate change for government to actually pay or help pay for some of these issues. They, as John said, they don't have the money. They won't have the money. So I think you're right. Like regulation, it will become regulated that people will need to act. Yeah, that's my take on that one. I think you're right.
Okay, I agree in principle. We have that issue, though, that when we're talking about the governments, the Republicans, the Conservatives, and others will not want to have increased regulation because they're all for small government. But whilst I believe we need regulation, I really worry about the quality of regulation. And I will say that involved with a number of things here. We've recently had our 4-yearly audit program. I'll call it that for our listeners because they don't need to know the detail of it. And they've redrafted the guidance for it. And I have been shouting, throwing virtual bricks at the screen and everything else, particularly when the government department responsible for it, we have a government department, Energy Security and Net Zero, they're called, and they did a webinar with 520 people attending it. And as far as I was concerned, they made it clear they didn't really understand how the regulations worked on the ground and what people had to do to follow them. And that in itself gets regulation a bad name and will make people against it. And I think it's difficult because regulation comes in when the market won't do it itself.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah. And actually, to add on to that, sorry, I know we mentioned this in previous podcasts, but it's kind of been a while. Education, right? Education to the marketplace.
Yes.
I talked to so many colleagues, and the vast majority has such ignorance towards what climate change is and what we're trying to do here. I think that people see it as a money grab. And I think a lot of people don't actually understand, the science behind it and what it actually requires. So I do find there's quite a bit of, ignorance on the employee side of companies where the CEO can say whatever they want to say. But if the people in your team don't actually understand what this means for your business, I think it'll fail.
Well said. I do a little caveat because we launched a product that's gone worldwide, and I was speaking to an Australian zoo, and I wasn't really well versed in Australia, but supposedly the federal government, for many years was not very big on climate change, dead against it. But the person I spoke was conveying that it didn't matter what the federal government did or didn't do. It's the company's values that drove them to make changes. And it was really interesting. I'd love to have them on a podcast that they had reduced their not only their energy costs, by the way, it was a business case, but also their carbon emissions. And it had nothing to do with regulations. It was driven by the company's values and what they believe in. So I guess there are organizations that will move because of that as well, right?
Yeah, and I think when we speak about all of this, we're not talking about, every company, every organization is going to operate differently. Some are going to do it because they want to do it. Some are going to do it because they have to do it. And I think there's no one size fits all for all of this. I think everyone's on their different path, depending on the industry and depending on how much they're polluting.
Can I take you back a bit, though? You were talking about education in terms of this. One of the things that I've noticed is that a lack of true understanding about climate change and renewable energy doesn't seem to stop people having an opinion on it and voicing that opinion quite loudly.
Agree, John.
I joke about it, but one of the things I dread if I go to a social occasion and we're there, and I don't make a big deal out of what I do when I'm social. When I'm social, I'm social. And then somebody will start saying something about, what about all these damned wind turbines? And you think to yourself, oh, do I
1,000, 2,000, 3,000.
Yeah. John, I was in a similar situation, and I think what this podcast has done is the more guests we have on and the more I learn, the less I know. So yeah. I think, the more you educate yourself, the more you realize that, you know what, you're not the expert on that topic and maybe you shouldn't have something to say. And it's about being open to learning. I think, of course, everyone has the right to their own opinion, but I think when you speak based on an opinion that's not embedded in fact, you spread misinformation. And I think we can all agree that the energy transition has lots of misinformation in the marketplace.
Yeah. Now, here's a question for us, for all of us then, and perhaps we're doing part of the answer. But the energy transition, if you like, has sort of bubbled up to the top. It's appeared, fine. But what are organisations doing to educate people on it? And I think, we're trying. There are a number of trade associations, professional bodies are all trying. But, even if we say, it should be in schools, well, key stage or whatever level you're at, you've got to get that in. That's going to take, 5, 10, 15 years before it comes through into the workplace. Too slow. Should we be in our respective countries, should we be having genuine public information? I don't know, broadcasts, publicity, I don't know what. The only problem with it is how do you do that and make it appear apolitical, that there isn't a political angle with it or that there's a bias with it? I think it is a major, major problem that we've said it so many times before. But, we're saying energy efficiency matters. Energy literacy, carbon literacy, climate change literacy and numeracy on all of those is absolutely essential. People need to understand enough of the science. And it's interesting when you talk to some people, when you start trying to say something about the science, it's, I don't want to know all about that. Because I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but in the UK, it's sometimes fine to be ignorant of science, but to be ignorant of art and literature, that says that you're not an educated person.
Interesting.
Yeah. I feel like we might be a little flipped with that.
Yeah. I think you're right, Lucinda.
I also think I've just given up my drum for a soapbox.
I think the unfortunate part is energy transition has been tied with politics.
It has.
Yes. People think it's a political thing. And I think it's really unfortunate, and it will take a long time to dissociate energy transition from, elections.
But here's a question for you. How in this world, actually, when we go to a world that's not based on fossil fuels, we will have succeeded in decoupling energy from geopolitics, perhaps. Because that's the big problem, isn't it? When we start looking at fossil fuels, what are our, not so much for you in North America, but maybe Europe-wide, our relationship with the Middle East becomes pretty critical. And so, things related to energy do become political. There's a big question. Would the world be a safer place if we didn't have any petrochemical, fossil fuels?
Dependency. You know what it would come down to, John? It would come down to natural resources. Who has the natural resources and who can leverage that? That's what it would do.
Yeah. That's moved a bit away from the energy transition. Sorry.
But it's maybe a next topic.
Yeah.
Well, to end off this episode, what advice would you give to clients to properly prepare for and execute their strategies amidst the energy transition?
Okay. It's basically restating what I've said at the beginning. I believe that if this is not understood, if it's dismissed, I think organizations will be challenged to be successful after 10 years. I think their employees may not want to be with them. I think their customers may not want to be with them. I think they could be losing business opportunities that are right in front of them, that's there now. John and I even talked to them. They don't even recognize that they're developing products now in this transition. They don't even recognize it. They dismiss it. But that market is massive. It's a massive market. And so if you don't get on this, I recognize that it sounds pretty stern and maybe desperate, but I do believe it will be problematic for organizations if they don't do it. period. And
John.
soon.
Okay, my advice, go back to basics. It really is. Understand what energy is, what it's about, how it drives your organisation, what you use it for, how you use it, understand how you measure it, understand what it costs, then understand what it links to in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you're not doing it already, start setting up a cross-discipline team to take on energy as part of what you're doing. Because I think there is a ladder. There's energy, carbon, sustainability, and engaging correctly with sustainability in environmental terms will lead to a sustainable economy.
And workforce, John. I think that was well stated, by the way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for a great episode on the energy transition.
Did we manage it in 30 minutes?
You went over, but I shouldn't be expecting anything else nowadays.
It's only 43 minutes, John.
Oh, that's not bad.
Talk to you next week.
Okay, thanks, Lysandra.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.